spring of 1830. A Sauk family returns from their winter hunt to the village they have lived in for generations. They have walked over 100 miles back to the bend in the Rock River where their grandparents are buried, where their children were born, where every spring for nearly a century the same fields have been planted by the same families. They reach the edge of the village, and it is gone. Not burned, not abandoned. Worse, white settlers are living in their lodges. Plows have torn through the corn rows. The earth above the family graves has been cut open. A man none of them have ever seen tells them, in a language most of them do not speak, that this land has not belonged to them since before they were born. He has a piece of paper to prove it. What that family did not yet know is that the piece of paper was a lie, and by the time the truth of how it had been written would catch up to the United States government, blood would already be in the river. This is the story of Saukenuk, and the chief who came home to find his land had been stolen with a signature he never gave. To understand the size of what was taken, you have to understand what Saukenuk actually was. It was not a small village. It was not a temporary camp. By the late 1700s, Saukenuk was the largest native settlement on the upper Mississippi River. More than 100 bark lodges stood on the north bank of the Rock River, just where it spilled into the Mississippi. In the warm months, somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 people lived there. That was enough for a small American city of the same era. They had been there roughly 100 years. Around the year 1750, the Sauk had migrated south from central Wisconsin under pressure from the French and the Ojibwe. They settled at the most fertile bend of the Rock River, where the soil was deep and the fishing was extraordinary. They cleared cornfields that ran for 2 miles up the Mississippi. They allied with the Meskwaki, who lived just upriver, and they built something that, by the standards of the upper Midwest, was a city. There was a small island in the rapids of the river they called their garden. Strawberries, plums, gooseberries, blackberries. Fish so plentiful you could spear them from the bank. Children spent entire summers on that island. Old men remembered being children there. The Sauk believed a good spirit lived in a cave beneath the rocks, white-feathered and enormous, and they were careful never to disturb him. They did not see this place as something they owned. They saw it as something they belonged to. That distinction is going to matter. In 1767, in one of those bark lodges, a child was born into the Thunder Clan. His given name in Sauk was Makatewe Meshi Kekekwa. In English, it translated to Black Sparrow Hawk. The village would come to call him by the shorter version, Black Hawk. He was not born into power. The Sauk had 2 kinds of leadership. There were hereditary civil chiefs who were born into specific clans and inherited the right to negotiate, to settle disputes, to speak for the tribe. And then there were war leaders, sometimes called war captains. Those positions were earned, not inherited. You earned them by leading raids, by surviving battles, by being the kind of man other warriors would follow into something dangerous. Black Hawk was the second kind. His father, Payesa, was the tribal medicine man. At 15, Black Hawk wounded an enemy in his first raid. By 19, he had led 200 Sauk warriors against an Osage encampment and personally killed 5 men and a woman. By his 30s, he was one of the most respected war leaders in the nation. He never held a hereditary title. He never sat on the council that signed treaties. And in the late summer of 1804, when something happened that would haunt him for the rest of his life, He was not even in St. Louis. He was at home, in Saukenuk, raising a family in the village he had been born in. In August of 1804, somewhere along the Cuivre River in what is now eastern Missouri, a small party of Sauk hunters crossed paths with 3 white settlers. The hunters killed all 3. The reasons are still debated: a border, blood, and very bad timing. The Sauk Tribal Council reacted the way they always did when something this serious happened. They convened. They denounced the killings. And they sent a delegation to St. Louis to make peace. That delegation was 5 men. Their leader was Quashquame. His name meant jumping fish. He maintained 2 villages of Sauk and Meskwaki families along the Mississippi, and he had a reputation for being respected without being feared. He was joined by Pashapaho, the stabber, Auchiquaha, the sunfish, Hashaquahiqua, the bear, and Leovois. What those 5 men carried with them was not the authority to sell land. They carried the authority to do exactly 2 things: to explain the killings and to negotiate the release of one of the killers who had been arrested by the Americans. Sauk custom on the matter was clear. To make the issue go away, the families of the victims had to be compensated. Horses, blankets, goods. It was called covering the dead. Once the families accepted the compensation, the matter was finished. No prison, no trial, no execution. That was what those 5 men believed they were going to St. Louis to do. That is not what was waiting for them. The man waiting for them was William Henry Harrison. In 1804, Harrison was 31 years old, ambitious, and the governor of the Indiana Territory. He had been given a job by Thomas Jefferson personally, and that job had nothing to do with murder trials. His job was to take the land. A year and a half earlier, in February of 1803, Jefferson had written him a private letter. It is one of the most revealing documents in American history, and Jefferson knew it. He told Harrison to keep the contents within his own breast, and especially out of the hands of the Indians. The strategy had 2 parts. First, drive the tribes into debt at American trading houses by selling goods at a loss until the Indians could not pay what they owed. Then, when the debts were larger than they could ever settle, accept a cession of land as payment. As Jefferson put it, lop them off by a cession of lands. Second, if any tribe resisted, threaten them. Jefferson wrote that American strength and Indian weakness were so visible that the tribes had only to be reminded that the government had only to shut our hand to crush them. This is the man Harrison answered to. These were his actual orders. For 2 years, Harrison had been trying to pry the Sauk and the Meskwaki off their land. They had refused him every time. Their custom was clear. Land could only be sold by the full tribal council, after a formal invitation, after a public announcement to the whole tribe, and after deliberation. No 5 men, no matter who they were, had the authority to give away an inch of Sauk soil. Harrison knew this. He had been negotiating with northwestern tribes for 2 years. There is no version of this story in which Harrison was confused about what he was doing. When Quashquame and his 4 companions arrived in St. Louis in October of 1804, Harrison saw an opportunity. 5 frightened, low-ranking Sauk men, separated from their council, desperate to free a friend, completely outside their normal procedures. He had them. What happened over the next several weeks in St. Louis is something the United States government has spent 2 centuries trying to forget. According to the Sauk who returned, and according to American officials who later admitted parts of it in writing, the 5 emissaries were kept in a state of near constant intoxication. American whiskey was abundant. The negotiations were long, tangled, and conducted partly in broken French, partly through interpreters whose loyalties belonged to Harrison. Harrison began with kindness. He distributed gifts. He spoke about friendship. He talked about American protection from the Osage, who were currently raiding the Sauk and Meskwaki along the Missouri River. He had also deliberately been showering the Osage with American gifts. The threat was implicit. The Osage have our protection. You do not. Yet. Then he turned to the question of land. In Black Hawk's later words, Harrison told a delegation that the American chief wanted some land, just a little. In exchange, the prisoner would be released, and the Osage would be reined in, and everyone could go home. The 5 men agreed. They believed they were ceding a small parcel along the west side of the Mississippi, possibly some land near a river called Jeffreyon, opposite the Illinois side. A token, something to satisfy the Americans and bring their friend home. What they actually signed on November 3, 1804, was the cession of approximately 50 million acres. 50 million. Most of what is now northern Illinois, a massive piece of southern Wisconsin, a strip of northeastern Missouri, the cornfields of Saukenuk, the garden island in the rapids, the grandmother graves, the bones of 100 years of Sauk dead. For all of it, the United States agreed to pay $2,234.50 in goods at signing, plus $1,000 a year afterward, to be split between the Sauk and the Meskwaki. $600 a year in trinkets for the Sauk homeland. Once Quashquam had touched the quill to the paper, Harrison did one more thing. He kept his promise. The prisoner was released. Black Hawk, who heard the story directly from the delegation when they returned, recorded what happened next in his autobiography. The prisoner walked out of his cell. He took a few running steps toward freedom. Then he was shot dead. The official explanation later given was that he was attempting to escape. The Sauk version was simpler. He was murdered in front of his friends. When Quashquam's party returned to Saukenuk, they did not understand what had happened. They told the council they had agreed to give the Americans a small piece of land in exchange for the prisoner's release, and that the prisoner had been killed anyway. They were vague on details. They were ashamed. Some of them, by their own later admission, had no clear memory of large portions of their time in St. Louis at all. The full text of the treaty, which was not translated for them and which they could not read, sat in a desk in Washington. For the next 24 years, the Sauk lived in Saukenuk. They planted corn. They buried their dead. They watched their children grow up. They believed they were home. And in Washington, drawer by drawer, the paperwork that would take all of it from them was being filed away. Quashquam himself never recovered from what he had done. The Sauk demoted him from principal chief to minor chief almost as soon as they understood the scope of the cession. Black Hawk recorded a conversation he had with Quashquam in old age, in which the disgraced chief insisted until the end that he had never agreed to sell their village. Whatever the papers said, he had not agreed to that. That on its own is a tragic story. And it is a familiar one in American Indian history. A delegation goes to negotiate. The Americans take more than was offered. The result is dressed up in legal language, signed, sealed, and made permanent. But the Treaty of 1804 is not the standard tragedy. It is something darker. Because much of what historians have pieced together about that signing did not surface for 100 years. Some of it never made it into American history textbooks at all. The histories that get taught in American classrooms tend to skip ahead to the war that came after, not the swindle that started it, because the swindle is harder to talk about. Here is what we know, beyond any reasonable doubt, about what really happened in St. Louis. The 5 men who signed the Treaty of 1804 were not authorized by the Sauk or Meskwaki to negotiate land. Sauk custom required a full tribal council and a public deliberation. None of that happened. William Henry Harrison knew this. He had spent 2 years among Northwestern tribes. He understood their procedures. He had been formally rebuffed multiple times by the proper Sauk councils. Thomas Jefferson knew this. He had personally instructed Harrison, in writing, to use trade debt and intimidation to acquire land, and had told him to keep the strategy hidden from the Indians themselves. Those instructions exist. They are in the Jefferson Papers, in his own handwriting. The 5 emissaries were drunk for most of the negotiations. Black Hawk recorded this. American officials later confirmed it. The treaty was conducted in a language the signers could not read, by interpreters who worked for Harrison. The prisoner the delegation came to free was shot dead in front of them, moments after the paper was signed. But the part that sits the heaviest, the part that is almost impossible to absorb when you actually let it land, is this. For 24 years after that signature, the Sauk continued to live in Saukenuk. 5,000 of them, in their own village, in their own homes, on land their ancestors had farmed for 100 years. They held their ceremonies. They harvested their corn. They taught their children the names of every bend in the Rock River. And they did not know. They did not know that in the eyes of the American government, the moment Quashquam's mark went on that paper, every blade of grass under their feet had been transferred to the United States. The largest single native land cession east of the Mississippi up to that point in American history, 50 million acres, was signed by 5 men who did not have the authority to sign it, in a language they could not read, while drunk, in exchange for the body of a friend who was murdered the moment he walked free. And the people whose home it was lived their lives, raised their children, and buried their dead in a country that was already on paper no longer theirs. The reckoning came in 1828. That spring, the Sauk and Meskwaki agent, Thomas Forsyth, informed the tribal chiefs they were going to have to leave. The 1804 treaty, he said, had given the United States the right to sell their land to American settlers, and the time had come. The Sauk chiefs denied it. They said no such cession had ever happened. Forsyth showed them the treaty. For most of the council, this was the first time they understood what those 5 drunk men had signed in St. Louis a quarter-century earlier. Most of the older civil chiefs, including Keokuk, the rival war leader who had risen during Black Hawk's absence in the War of 1812, accepted the situation as hopeless and led most of the Sauk west of the Mississippi. Black Hawk refused. In the summer of 1830, settlers began moving into Saukenuk, while the Sauk were on their winter hunt. Lodges were occupied, fences were thrown up across the cornfields, burial grounds were broken open by plows, When the families came home that spring, they walked into a stranger's village standing on top of their own. In June of 1831, Illinois Governor John Reynolds sent the militia. Black Hawk, badly outnumbered, slipped his people across the Mississippi at night and signed a humiliating document soon after. It was called the Corn Treaty. In exchange for promised rations to keep his people from starving, he agreed never to return to Illinois. Then the winter of 1831 and 1832 came. It was harder than any winter in living memory. The promised corn did not arrive in the quantities pledged. Children died. Old people died. By February, Black Hawk's people were boiling bark for soup. And on the other side of the river, just out of reach, sat Saukenuk, empty for the winter because the white settlers had gone home until spring. On the morning of April 5th, 1832, at a place along the Mississippi called Yellow Banks, Black Hawk gave the order. Roughly 1,000 people stepped into canoes, 500 warriors, 500 women, children, and elderly. They did not paddle quietly. They did not move at night. They moved in daylight, in formation, with banners and ceremonial pipes, the way a people move when they are coming home. They were not a war party. They had brought their families. They had brought everything they owned, and they pushed across the Mississippi back into Illinois. Black Hawk's plan was not to attack white settlements. His plan was to settle peacefully at the village of a Ho-Chunk prophet named White Cloud, 50 miles up the Rock River, where he had been promised refuge and a chance to plant a crop. He had been told that British support was coming. He had been told other tribes would join him. He had been told that the Americans, faced with a peaceful resettlement of women and children, would have to negotiate. He had been told a great deal of things that were not true. But on that morning, in April of 1832, none of that had happened yet. The frontier had not yet erupted in panic. 3 young men, whose names would one day appear on American currency, had not yet ridden out to find him. The river had not yet run red at Bad Axe. On that morning, an old chief, 65 years old, the son of a medicine man, born in the lodges of Saukenuk, had decided that the country of his birth was not going to belong to a piece of paper signed by 5 men in his absence. He had decided to come home. And the war that everyone but him saw coming was already on its way. The Treaty of St. Louis was signed on November 3, 1804. The first shot of the Black Hawk War was fired on May 14, 1832. 28 years separated those 2 dates. Black Hawk would later say, in his autobiography, that the Treaty of 1804 had been the origin of all the serious difficulties between his nation and the whites. He was not wrong. Every battle of the war that bears his name traces back to a piece of paper signed in St. Louis by 5 frightened men who did not understand what they were giving away. The Black Hawk War was not a war of conquest. It was a war about a fraud. And in the next episode, we will see what happened when Black Hawk, just a few weeks after that crossing, sent 3 of his own men under a white flag of truce to ask the Americans for peace, and what the Americans did to those 3 men. Subscribe to Military Hmmm, because the war that began with a stolen signature is about to begin in earnest.